Live and direct, live and I take no jive.
Legalize it.
So how much can a koala bear? Koala bear, koala bear. Koala bear. Barry pulls a joint out of his pocket. Bill says, "Great, Barry, a reefer."
Hi, and welcome back. It's another episode of the Koala podcast. And in this episode, I'm talking to Craig Cesal. I hope I pronounced it correctly. It's a soft C rather than a hard C, Craig?
No, it's Cecil. It's a soft.
It's Cecil. Okay. Craig was a federal cannabis prisoner, and we're going to talk about that experience because a lot of people, I noticed, write about it, but they never actually talk to the individuals who actually had that experience, or if so, they brush over the conversation very quickly. And then we're going to talk about how he engaged with a couple of organizations on his way out of the federal penitentiary system. Craig, welcome to the Koala podcast. Thank you very much for taking time to be on the show. I'd love to just talk to you about your life and how what led you to being a non-violent federal cannabis prisoner, and what was your experience through that, and how did you engage with the outside world and your family engage with the outside world to get you out of that system?
Well, just by a bit of history, my case started in conjunction with the 9/11 attacks here in the United States.
Well, that's something I'm very aware of because I was 2 blocks away that morning when that happened. So that's a rather large part of my life.
Well, I'm sorry for that. And I mean, I'm sorry the whole episode took place. But law enforcement took on a whole different shift after that. And where I got caught up by them is I owned a towing and truck repair facility here in the west suburbs of Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
And some of my customers, the drivers would regularly brag that, oh, yeah, to pick up extra money, I'll haul some marijuana for, different people that pay me well to do it. They say they just put it in addition to different loads in their trucks, and they would haul it across country for a fee. But because I was helping them in their endeavor, albeit indirectly by maintaining their trucks, after September 11th, because marijuana in those days was primarily coming from Mexico, that caught the attention of federal officials who were really apt to take a look at foreign people and foreign activities in the wake of September 11th. And they arrested me as being part of that marijuana conspiracy. They said my role, was necessary and it helped them, even though it wasn't drug trafficking.
Yeah.
Well, here, because I couldn't point out any sort of terrorist activity, and I couldn't even point out to people when, where, and how they were doing, although I had no prior criminal history whatsoever, because I didn't snitch on somebody, because I didn't tell on somebody else, they made an example out of me and sentenced me to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. To be honest, I was given a longer service than a murderer would receive.
Sorry, I know, I understand. Well, I don't understand that. I understand their thinking that I don't understand, but I just find it. I mean, it's beyond comprehension.
Unfortunately, it's what I learned in the prison environment. At least I went in as a paralegal, and I spent my time in there writing a lot of post-conviction and prison condition lawsuits in court for the other people in the prison system. So I learned a lot about other people's stories, about the system, about things of that nature. But what happened in the long haul is I caught the attention of a lot of the marijuana advocacy groups. Just because I was a first-time offender, a life sentence, and the government admits I never bought or sold marijuana, and I never even, received a financial gain from marijuana. But nevertheless, they championed my situation. Many of the cannabis advocacy groups.
And were they getting in touch with you directly to find out what had happened to you, or did they just read the case, and just say, "Oh, we're going to champion this guy"?
There was a little bit of both because
Yeah.
I received a lot of press coverage, so I got picked up by, many of the groups that said that they were in the cannabis, arena. But what really got me is during the Trump administration, the COVID epidemic started here. And there were special provisions made for prisoners to protect them from COVID in the prison, especially if they were like me, over 60 years old, diabetic, and otherwise susceptible to, or more susceptible to the effects of COVID than a young, healthy person. So, what the activists all piled on and did is they managed to get me released from the prison to home confinement.
And which particular activist group worked the hardest at that time to do that? Because I presume you
It
must have
was
been were you in contact with them while they were doing it? How did that
absolutely
operate?
it was the Marijuana Lifer Project under an author named Sherry Sicard, an
Mhm.
activist, and she has quite an army behind her. The federal government just received hundreds of contacts from her army, and they found it easier to release me on home confinement than to put up with all the harassment they were receiving from her army.
Yeah, no, just like go
But
away, go away, go away.
but immediately upon my release, a group stood up and did all kinds of press releases, especially in California, to newspapers, to all over the place, saying, "Look what we did. We got this prisoner out of prison." And this was a relatively new group. The group was less than a year old. And I had no dealings with them. They had nothing to do with my
So, so,
situation.
so I presume we're talking about the Last Prisoner Project. You had never received a phone call or written letter from this group.
No. But they did some
And had
significant.
anybody in your family received a phone call or written letter from this group?
No, be honest, they were new and really not now. Unfortunately, when they did all these press releases, the people that were in the arena, especially Sherry Sicard, who really led the fight for me, they were obviously livid.
I'm not
And Sherry,
unsurprisingly.
well, Sherry engaged her army again. So they started just harassing the heck out of the Last Prisoner Project. And what Last Prisoner Project's answer to that is that in order to mollify them and just quiet them, they said, "How about this? We have right now two full-time employees. We'll hire Craig as a full-time employee to work with prisoners and all that. We'll pay him. We'll give him a job straight out of prison. We'll do all these things for him." And that did quiet them up because they were afraid of knocking me out of a
Out of a
a good
job,
paying
and
job
out of
fresh out of
the
prison.
possibility of supporting your family and all those sorts of things.
My job description, changed like the wind there, especially as they hired more and more people, and especially as they were funded by the burgeoning cannabis industry in the states that allowed cannabis distribution, and they were basically a front for these marijuana people to show that they were doing some sort of philanthropy.
So, I mean, can I just sort of dial back? It's like when they first hired you, what did they say you were doing? And if it's not too intrusive, what were they paying you?
They started me at a salary of $60,000. This was in 2021. And I was basically work from home because I was on home confinement. I couldn't do much but stay at home. But I was allowed to travel and do um, a lot of presentations in front of groups, primarily for their fundraising. I was used as an example of,
So, yeah,
although
so I
they
mean,
no longer claim to be the ones that got me out of prison, they were kind of, implying it otherwise.
and so, your skills that you'd learned in prison that were actually practical skills to maybe help people in the process of getting out of a federal penitentiary weren't really used. Rather, as you say, you were used as a bit of a front for money raising opportunities with cannabis companies at a time where the social equity was the buzzword, wasn't it?
Absolutely. And unfortunately, it still is.
Yeah.
The cannabis industry wants to show that they are engaged in philanthropy, but, and they donate literally millions of dollars to groups, especially like the Last Prisoner Project, who will go out and, do press releases that say the industry as a whole is responsible for this. Unfortunately, in my case, what they claimed as their credit wasn't true, and that still is their way of doing things, unfortunately.
So you said that as time moved forward and they hired more people, where did you find yourself being put? And can you give us some insight as to what sort of people they were hiring for what sort of purposes in terms of the organization? Were they practical people with legal skills who are looking to highlight prisoner cases and actually move them through the system to get out? Or was it more on the marketing, money raising side of things?
It was primarily fundraising, and the all the upper management at the Last Prisoner Project were all postgraduate degree people from Ivy League schools. A bunch of them from Harvard Law that all went to class together, but they had been interconnected before the Last Prisoner Project took root. So that they were already all connected. They had a vision before Last Prisoner Project provided them that venue to raise a lot of money and and have some political ties along with it.
So, I mean, moving forward, you work with them for how many years?
I worked for them for a bit over a year.
Okay.
And unfortunately, what happened at that time is there was a bill put up before the U.S. Congress called the MORE Act. I forgot it. It's an acronym, and I forgot what it is, but the M is marijuana. And it was somewhat of a bill to legalize marijuana in the United States. But the Last Prisoner Project, because their donations came from the industries that held the very limited number of state licenses, they obviously did not want wholesale legalization of marijuana in the United States because I mean, that was their niche of their donors was to have these licenses, at the expense of everyone else. So their donors wanted marijuana to remain illegal, really just so that the government was fighting their competitors for them by arresting them. The MORE Act had provisions in it where people other than these license holders could be arrested by the federal government. The legalization bill truly was not a legalization bill.
It
Protection.
sounds like an earlier discussion of what's happening now between the marijuana. I hate to use the word marijuana, so I'm going to use the word cannabis companies and hemp companies. In my mind, it's all the same thing, but there's this internal set of uh, discourse, all based around money, that pushes forward industry over human beings. And is that what you saw towards the end of your time at Last Prisoner Project? Is that really the money and the policy was more important than the individuals? And the reason I raise this is because my my reading of the Last Prisoner Project over the years that I have read about it and seen what it says it does is it's all about individuals and their families. But when I looked into their finances through their official records, I couldn't see any specific allocations of money that is spent on that. It just seems to be in the general spend. So you don't really have an idea how much money is spent on helping families or individuals in one way or another, whether that be legal or whether that be support because they don't have an earner, a primary earner in the family. Is that what you were seeing when you were there?
Yes, I was fighting to get them to help some people and some causes. And that's what really led to it as it related to the MORE Act, because I had cultivated connections through a lot of groups. I was speaking out against the provisions in it that would keep people going to prison for marijuana other than this very, minute group. And I was even invited through some of my other connections. I ended up testifying before our U.S. Senate uh, Judicial Committee in a committee meeting about what I didn't like about the MORE Act and the way it further penalized the people already penalized for marijuana would end up penalizing a lot more.
And sorry, just to stick with a little bit of detail, were you invited by the committee or were you put forward by the organization to speak to the committee?
No, I actually cultivated that through Senator Dick Durbin from my home state of Illinois.
Okay.
And so that one, now some groups outside that had no connection to Last Prisoner Project coached me on how to testify before Congress and things like that. It was a great experience. Last Prisoner Project was livid because their donors do not want the wholesale legalization of marijuana and decriminalization of marijuana that I was advocating for.
Mm-hmm.
Last Prisoner fired me because I advocated for relief for people already in prison and to stop locking up people for marijuana.
And did they state that explicitly? I mean, how were you fired, for example? Did you receive a letter? Did you receive a phone call? Did you receive an email? And was it specific in the terms of modern days, the letting go of you? Were they general or specific for the reason for doing so?
Well, the reason was specific in that I had this contact with these groups and before the Senate. Now, it didn't go to the content of what I said, just the fact that I had testified before the U.S. Senate. And they went further because a lot of people knew that I worked for the Last Prisoner Project. They gave me a significant severance package so long as I didn't tell people why I was fired, that I was in fact fired for advocating for relief for people in prison for marijuana.
So again, that leads to then another question. So if you received that severance pay and you signed a piece of paper to that effect, I presume, because as you say, you're dealing with lawyers on the board. Why do you feel that you can speak about this now?
Unfortunately, these were very young lawyers that wrote it. And according to the experienced lawyers I went to, the non disclosure agreement that they put in my severance package and my separation agreement, the way they wrote it, it expired when they quit paying me severance.
And so,
So,
they did a few tranches of severance for X period of time, and then your lawyers say that essentially once that's over, you're free to speak.
yes. And they were, it was kind of funny because this was written by two lawyers that, were the head people of the Last Prisoner Project. And the lawyer that looked it over was laughing, saying, I can't believe a lawyer did this. But sadly, they did leave after my 6 months of severance. I was free to talk about anything I wanted to.
And how have you
It's
found?
not a binding
No, it's not a
non-disclosure
binding
agreement.
agreement. I presume you think that they weren't aware that they didn't create a non-binding agreement.
I'm sure of it.
Have you been speaking fairly regularly to sections? So, I mean, for example, have you spoken to these other organizations who actually helped you in terms of the Senate committee, getting out of prison, and the other work that you've done about this experience with LPP? And have you also spoken to other media about it? And is there interest in from others in learning more about how this organization operates?
To be honest, the other groups that I would consider the more enlightened, or the groups that are, truly on a mission to help the um, people in prison for marijuana, they are all very well aware of what happened to me. But to be honest, they didn't like Last Prisoner Project going in. They had all had bad experiences with Last Prisoner. So I just kind of added to that. But one thing I've also found since I've been out is there's a lot of groups that are connected, that are receiving marijuana related funds, especially in several states. And two of them that are prominent is California and Illinois. The tax that they levy against marijuana sales, or the condoned marijuana sales in those states, that tax money doesn't go into the general fund of the state to be spent as tax receipts. It goes to special interest groups. It goes to special interest projects. And I've worked for just for a short amount of time for two of those. It was sad. One of them I could think of was to push diversity, racial diversity and just people diversity throughout the industry. But unfortunately, they didn't do anything to that end.
And can you
But while I worked
are you
there,
in a position to name that organization?
not right now.
Yeah.
But there is several.
For me, I haven't got a particular thing against Last Prisoner Project, but they seem to be the elephant in the room because they're bigger. That represents an issue that you're highlighting within these types of organizations in the US that are supported by the cannabis industry, marijuana industry, and by default, their customers who are told one story about where their money is going in terms of their 1% of our money goes to this to help people in marginalized communities or people in prison or people with one leg, or this sort of there's that message that's always being pushed. But I get a sense that across a good 40% of these organizations, as you say, it's really special interests. As always, it's follow the money, but at some point you can't follow the money unless we're speaking to somebody like yourself who has a limited amount of experience working for these organizations, where you sort of know what they're doing, but because you're not a board level, you're never going to know exactly what they're doing.
Well, Last Prisoner sets themselves apart by being, since their inception, being ran by some very highly educated, people whose education and skill is in gathering money and spinning press coverage. That is their major skill. That these other groups that are their primary interest is helping prisoners, they usually come from just a general society, and they were brought into that by being just part of a justice impacted family, by they themselves serving time in prison, as I served over 19 years coming out. But I of course have no skill in raising $5 to $10 million a year. But the people at Last Prisoner Project set themselves apart by being those people, and that's to say nothing against their skill. They are extremely skilled at what they do, but what they do is not helping prisoners.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is for me, this is the question: is what is it that they do? If they're very skilled at raising very large numbers of money, and if you look at their website, you see a limited amount of people that they say they have got out of the federal penitentiary system, although there's little detail as to how those processes happened. Is there money being spent on basically, as you intimated earlier, on policy at state and federal level that to me almost seems to preserve a status quo?
No, how they nowadays, how they take credit for getting people out of prison, as they took credit for me, is in my last 6 or 8 months there, I could gather up names of people that were in federal prison and even in state prison for egregious sentences related only to marijuana. But rather than them hiring lawyers or rather than them using their own legal skills who were lawyers, what they did is they turned them over to a free group, the, the National Association of Criminal
Well,
Defense
and,
Lawyers.
and I was sort of I sort of asked you that question as a leading question because I highlighted that when I wrote an article because they pushed that on their website, and I recently looked at their website about 2 weeks ago, and I see no reference to that organization. I also contacted that organization, and as yet am to receive a reply from them saying yay or nay in terms of how they worked with them. It's been a bit of a dead end for me in terms of investigating that.
Um, at last I've heard, and this has been over a year, but NACDL, the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, started to pull back from them just because Last Prisoner Project was receiving a whole lot of bad press. And they didn't, of course, want that to rub off on them.
No, well,
But the answer to
they're an
that
old
was
organization and quite well respected, aren't they?
yes, they are. And for good reason. But what Last Prisoners Project to that was, is one of their part time lawyers there, Last Prisoner gave them a very large salary to push for Last Prisoner within the NACDL. So basically, it was buying their way out of trouble.
Well, very, very interesting indeed, because I've managed to locate no information from either organization on that front. Look, we don't have long to go on the podcast. Where do you think we are now? If you were running Last Prisoner Project, put yourself in that fantasy chair, what would you like to do and how would you like to run it?
I don't know if I could save Last Prisoner because they can no longer get the support from the groups that truly do help people. As you say, even NACDL is ashamed to be associated with them. So I'm almost wondering if they're a foregone conclusion. But what I do want to see is our big fight in the US here is we have the cannabis industry spending a ton of money in campaign donations and things of that nature to keep from a wholesale legalization of marijuana. And what I'd like to see is um, a bigger thrust to put that in the press. For instance, the senator that originally put me on the Senate Judiciary Committee meeting was completely in favor of wholesale legalization at that time. But three of the largest cannabis companies in the United States are based here in Illinois, actually in the Chicago area. And they made some huge donations to Senator Durbin. And now he's no longer pro cannabis.
Yeah, with a few minutes to go, is that yeah, in the end, money talks, and any part of that U.S. political infrastructure, whether they be an advocacy group, whether they be a politician, whether they even be a grassroots organization, as soon as money leaks into those setups. And I'm not saying one is worse than another, but this is a good example of how the system is working, and it's working for capital, it's not working for people, which is the conversation that I'm hearing not just in the US but around the world at the moment. And this is a very good little example, but a very sad example, because there are people in prison who shouldn't be in prison, people talking about getting them out, but the reality of that happening seems fairly slim.
I agree. And I agree. And it's again because it's really not front and center what's going on. There's a very small number of people that are making really big money from cannabis here in the US. But that group, by engaging the Last Prisoner Project and by other methods, are extremely good at protecting their
Their turf.
monopolies. And
Yeah.
And that's what I think, that's where we need to, I think if there's going to be a solution to the people in prison and the people that are still going to prison for marijuana that they've grown in their backyard, then, they can grow watermelons all day long in the backyard. And as long as they don't sell a huge amount, the law, recognizes it and doesn't bother them. We need the same thing for marijuana. But right now, that that small group of people that are really taking in big amounts of money from the cannabis industry are really good at protecting their fiefdom, their monopoly.
Well, Craig, thank you very much for coming on to the Karma Koala podcast and spreading a little bit of light on the darkness, because I think it's really, really important. Look, and before we go, I've tried to speak to a number of people, and most people don't have the bravery and confidence that you have, and I can hear it in your voice. It's stressful. It's hard to talk about, but thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me and getting some of this information out into the wider world.
19 years in prison for marijuana. Changes you.
It changes you. Yes, I would have I'd have no imagination about that at all, because it's so divorced from my experience. But yes, I can't imagine the toughness involved in that experience.
But I'm asking you to keep up the good fight. Put the information out there so people actually know what's going on, not what they are told is going on.
Craig, thank you very much for being on the Karma Koala podcast.
Live and direct, live and a date no jive.
Legalize it. So how much can a koala bear? Koala bear, koala bear. Koala bear. Barry pulls a joint out of his pocket. Bill says, "Great, Barry, a reefer."